best explains what we see in the data is that health is political. And that by political we mean a definition of politics of a struggle over this allocation of scarce and precious social goods. And if health is political, when we're talking about scarce and precious social goods, we're talking about things like a grocery store in your neighborhood or a park. And if health is political, then the question becomes, what does power have to do with it? How do we create social, political, and economic power in communities that are struggling to essentially deal with good health? All right, and I'm not getting any help from my slides at all. So, all right, I'm just going to talk. So the typical way that I offer these presentations is as I show you a quotation from Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln is known as the great emancipator. The Republican Party refers to themselves as the Party of Lincoln. But the reality is, when you look at actually Lincoln's speeches and his comments, Lincoln was an avowed white supremacist. And those notions of white supremacy have essentially been baked into our original institutions and into many of our original documents, including the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And the impact of that is that we have created a narrative in this country, a narrative which argues that some people are more deserving than others. And there are sort of valued Americans and there are devalued Americans. And that narrative shapes policy. And you don't have to look very far. You can look at health policy. Virtually every other Western industrialized country has a universal healthcare system. The United States does not. And when you look into the history of that, it doesn't take very much to see that that is primarily driven by racism and a narrative of exclusion and an effort through policy to exclude certain populations. So if the narrative excludes people, then the policies exclude people. The policies create conditions. And those conditions are the things that shape your health and the opportunities that you have, or it shapes essentially the disadvantage that you have to navigate in order to pursue health. And so the basic thesis of this work is that if you want to change conditions, the conditions in parts of Bakersfield and South Kern where people don't have reliable access to parks, to full-service grocery stores, in some cases to potable drinking water. If you want to change those conditions, you have to change the policies that essentially allocate assets, health protective assets, to various different communities. And if you want to change policies, you have to change the narrative. So that's the basic thesis. And you're all welcome to have these slides when they finally become available. So given that thesis, I want to tell you a story about my own personal experience. I grew up in Canada, Montreal, Canada, which is Canada's a country that has a strong social contract. It has universal health care, universal childcare, universal dental care for children, paid sick leave for all working people, deep investments in public art and public resources, community centers, and so Canada invested in me. I grew up there in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, and with two brothers. And okay, well now my slides came up again. I don't know why.
Benny's working on the back end, so
yeah, your assistant gave me your slides so I could share them on my screen so it won't limit your bandwidth. So if you want to direct me, I could just click as you go.
Okay, so you have my slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. So if you can advance a couple slides, and I'm assuming everybody can see these.
Yes, we should.
Yeah, keep going. Okay, and stop there. Okay, great. So this is the other, I try to state my conclusions up front so people can understand, where I'm going with this. And one of the other big conclusions, other than health is political, is that health is not health care. Where you live matters. And if you click it one more time, it matters a lot. And I'm going to try to prove that to you, showing you some data. If you can advance the slide. And then one more time, great. And then the third conclusion is that health is an investment, and that countries with strong social contracts like Canada that I was telling you about have better health. They have longer life expectancy, less chronic disease, and better overall health. Next slide. I have to move kind of quickly. So this is the quote I was going to tell you about from Abraham Lincoln. It reads, "I will say then that I am not, nor ever have been, in favor of bringing about in any way the social and political equality of the white and black races, that I am not, nor ever have been in favor of making voters or jurors of Negroes, nor of qualifying them to hold office, nor intermarry with white people. And I will say in addition to this that there is a physical difference between the white and black races, which I believe will forever forbid the two races living together on terms of social and political equality. And inasmuch as they cannot so live, while they do remain together, there must be the position of superior and inferior. And I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race." Next slide, please. That was Abraham Lincoln. Many of us have been to the Lincoln Memorial, and we recognize we don't see that language carved into marble on the walls of the Lincoln Memorial. Next slide. And if you can actually just click it twice. That's the Gettysburg Address. And the next slide is the second inaugural address. And you see nowhere there any evidence of Lincoln's avowed white supremacy. Next slide. Lincoln went on to say that our Republican system was meant for a homogeneous people. Go back one, please. You're moving a little fast. Our Republican system was meant for a homogeneous people. As long as blacks continue to live with the whites, they constitute a threat to the national life. Family life may also collapse, and the increase of mixed breed bastards may someday challenge the supremacy of the white man. Okay, next slide. Most people are surprised to know that that was Abraham Lincoln who said that. But we live in a world with these narratives, these battling narratives. One big theme is income inequality. Next slide. Mass incarceration, hit it again, please. College protests, and again. A refugee crisis, again. Black Lives Matter, again. Moral Mondays, that's a movement to restore Martin Luther King's movement against poverty in North Carolina. Next slide. And of course, Standing Rock and Indigenous people's rights. Next slide. And a number of different Native American and Indigenous rights movements. Next slide. There's a theme that runs through all of these, which is exclusion. And so I want to emphasize this point that there is a narrative in this country. It's not the only narrative in this country, but there is a narrative that competes for dominance in this country, and that narrative is of exclusion. And you only have to look to our current president to see how that narrative is constructed. That narrative is very, very much intentional. Next slide. So this is what a narrative of exclusion does. It does three things. One, it intentionally dehumanizes the target. And again, you just look to our president, who says about Mexican Americans and Latinos, they're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists. Or other politicians who talk about makers versus takers, or welfare queens, or super predators. That's not an accident. That's a very intentional effort to dehumanize the target of the policy. The second thing that a narrative of exclusion does is it exaggerates the notion of scarcity. And it argues essentially that immigrants are taking away our resources, they're taking away our jobs, they're taking away things that belong to us and not to them. So it creates this tribal competition between groups. And the third thing it does is it looks to the past nostalgically and says, things were so much better in the 1950s, never mind segregation and all of the mistreatment of various different populations, including women. And it looks to the future with fear. It says that we are being encroached upon and we need to defend ourselves. Next slide. The good news is that there's also a narrative of inclusion, which is competing in this country and is actually dominant in California. It's not thoroughly dominant, but it's much more in the ascendancy in California than it is in other parts of the country. And it does almost the exact opposite. One of the things that it does is it changes the narrator and allows people to tell their own story, to essentially speak to their shared humanity. And the South Kern Soul is a perfect example of that by elevating the voices of folks in the communities in South Kern and allowing people to tell their own stories. They're creating a narrative of inclusion and allowing people to change the narrator about who speaks for a community. The second thing a narrative of inclusion does is it broadens the lens to show how we're mutually dependent and interconnected in our fates. And it highlights the fact that we live in a world of abundance. And nowhere is this clearer than with the COVID-19 crisis, where we see that our fates are inextricably intertwined, that our vulnerability basically comes down to the most vulnerable of us actually are tied to the most protected. And then finally, a narrative of inclusion, it looks to the past realistically. It acknowledges things like racism, American apartheid, the injustices committed and atrocities against Native Americans, the internment of Japanese, the Chinese Exclusion Act. And it looks to the future with purpose and hope and says that we're all better off together. Next slide. Okay, let me tell you about place really quickly. Next slide. Just hit it several times, like 4 times. Okay, so this is the place I grew up. This is Montreal, Canada. Keep advancing it, please. I described this to you. It's a beautiful city with a lot of infrastructure. Keep going. And again, I grew up in this country in the 70s and 80s. And next slide. And it really invested in me. It's got state-of-the-art public transportation. Next slide, please. This is a view of the city downtown, the St. Lawrence River in the background, and McGill University in the foreground. So Canada has a strong social contract. I mentioned some of these things. These are investments that the society makes in everyone. There's only one thing I want you to look at on this slide other than the beautiful Canadian flag, and that is the word universal. Note the first 3 policies start with the word universal. If you want to see a strong social contract in any country, look for that word. Next slide. Okay, in the mid-'80s, I left Montreal to go to Baltimore, Maryland. Advance it one more time. And I went to Johns Hopkins Medical School. Next slide, please. And if you can hit it 4 times, thank you. These are the scenes from Johns Hopkins, East Baltimore, immediately adjacent to Johns Hopkins Medical School. And I'd never seen anything like this before in my life. In fact, I was so shocked that I asked one of my classmates, when was there a war here? And I'll never forget what he said to me. He said, what do you expect? It's the inner city. And I had no expectation that any place could look like this or should look like this. If you go to the next slide, please. And I asked myself, well, what if I grew up in East Baltimore? I mean, this kid, for all intents and purposes, is me. This kid did not create the environment in which he navigates every single day of his life in East Baltimore, any more so than I created the environment in Montreal, Canada. But the message to this kid, and kids are not stupid, they get it. I mean, just look at the environment. These kids know that they're being devalued. They know that the society doesn't care about them. Next slide. And so I left Baltimore and subsequently saw other parts of the country and recognized that this is not just Baltimore and it's not just Black people. This is Scott County, Indiana. Next slide. If you can hit it like 3 times, please. Scott County, Indiana is notorious for having an HIV/AIDS epidemic that actually led to an incidence of HIV that was the highest in the world. higher than sub-Saharan Africa. Scott County, Indiana was in the midst of an HIV/AIDS epidemic, if you could advance it one more. And Scott County, Indiana is 98% white, rural and poor. And it got taken over by an opiate epidemic, next slide please, and drove an hepatitis C and HIV epidemic. And if you can advance it one more slide please. And it taught me that the problem isn't just race. Race is one of the driving root causes of America's failure to construct a social contract, but it's not just race. And in fact, racism has collateral damage. And the collateral damage of racism is the best explanation for what you're seeing in Scott County, Indiana. It's the lack of social solidarity, the lack of universal policies that help people when they fall on tough times and help whole communities when they fall on tough times. So folks lacking health care, lacking access to reasonable job benefits, lacking access to childcare, dental care, housing supports, all of those things create social vulnerability. Next slide, please. The question for us is like, what is the American social contract? Advance it one more time, please. And the answer is, I can't tell you. I don't know. I don't know what it is that America guarantees for all of its citizens. I don't know why America has so few guarantees for all its citizens, but I can tell you that this country is unique in the developed world in that regard. Advance it one more, please. So I left Baltimore with this question on my mind that in America, when it comes to your health, does your zip code matter more than your genetic code? Advance it one more time, please. Next slide. And so that took me to San Francisco Bay Area eventually, and that's San Francisco on the map for those of you who don't recognize it from a Google map. Advance it one more, please. And across the bay is Alameda County, which is this big green boot-shaped county that looks like it's trying to crush San Francisco. I'm showing you this because I'm going to show you a few maps in a second. Next slide. I became the health officer in Alameda County, and one of the things that you do when you're the health officer, next slide please, is that you become the registrar of all births and deaths. And there are about 10,000 deaths in Alameda County every year and about 20,000 births. And every one of the deaths has a death certificate, the births have a birth certificate. And you can see on the death certificate, every single one, what somebody died of, what their race, ethnicity was, where they lived, and their age. And if you can hit it 4 times, please, just advance it 4 times. So every death certificate has this data on it. And we took 500,000 death certificates in Alameda County over a period of about 55 years. And we looked at patterns of death across Alameda County. Next slide, please. And the first thing you see when you look at those patterns, next slide again, you take the death certificates and you can translate it into the map. This is the map of Alameda County, and each of those bounded areas, there are about 150 of them, are census tracts, which are an approximation of neighborhoods. Not a perfect approximation, but a fairly good approximation. And we stratified those neighborhoods into life expectancies, with the red having life expectancies less than 74 years, the green having life expectancies greater than 80 years, and the yellow being between 74 and 80. And when you do that, you recognize patterns. One of the patterns you see is that in the flatlands of Oakland, which are in the foot of this boot-shaped county, and the flatlands of Berkeley, you see a lot of premature death. It's concentrated, it's clustered in these areas, and scattered in a few other areas, but they're all areas that are fairly well known to the health department. Next slide. This slide got a lot of attention, this map. It ended up on the front page of the San Francisco Chronicle, which is the next slide, please. There it is. So front page of the San Francisco Chronicle, and people wanted to understand what was happening in Alameda County. How could we explain this? Next slide. One of the things we wanted to show that it was not just Alameda County. So we took our map, if you could advance it several times, and We took our Alameda County map and we went to Baltimore and we replicated that analysis in Baltimore. We did the same thing in Cleveland. We went to Denver. Advance it, please, again. And we went to New York City, again, Seattle, King County, to Boston, if you keep advancing it, please, LA, Minneapolis, Philadelphia, San Antonio, Texas. We also went to Chicago and to Cincinnati. We did the entire map of California, in fact, and so you can see Bakersfield and Kern on this map. And I'm going to show you a little bit more of Kern later. So we have life expectancy for every neighborhood in California. Next slide. I'm going to skip this. Just go to the next slide, just for time. And just let you know that you can actually do this yourself. All of the life expectancies for every census tract in the United States are available at the National Center for Health Statistics. Next slide. And again, please. I'm trying to make up some time here. So one of the questions we get asked often is sort of like, well, isn't this about immigrants? Isn't this about people of color? Doesn't that explain why the United States health statistics are not as good as others? We're a country that is very generous, and we take in the tired, the poor, the sick, the huddled masses. And, you know, folks have come up to me at presentations and said the reason that our health statistics aren't good is because of people of color and immigrants in particular. And they come here and they're sick and they drag down our averages. And I thought, okay, well, we need to make some more slides. So next slide. This is Time Magazine sort of hinting at what I'm about to show you. Next slide. So you've all seen this slide, I hope. This is how much we spend on a per person basis on healthcare in the United States compared to all other developed countries. Whenever you make this slide, you actually have to change the axis of the graph to fit the US on the slide with every other country in the world, because we spend on average twice what the rest of the developed world spends on healthcare per person. Next slide. For what we spend, we don't get very good outcomes. This is an analysis that two very smart women decided to do after years of looking at the same data on per person spending on healthcare. They decided to look at per person spending on healthcare, which is in the blue there, and then adding to that per person spending on social services and benefits for each of these countries. And what they showed is that when you add healthcare to social services, that the United States is actually not the biggest spender in the world. We're not actually spending more than others. We're just spending our money very badly. We spend our money disproportionately on medical care, and we spend less on social services and benefits. And so the point of this slide is that you look at the blue, that's medical care. You look at the red, that's the social contract. So the countries that are doing more spending on prevention, on social services, on benefits to keep people out of the emergency room in the hospital have better health. Next slide. These are those two women. The book is called The American Healthcare Paradox. It's gotten a lot of attention. Next slide. They showed that for most developed countries, for every dollar spent on healthcare, roughly $2, twice as much is spent on social services. In the United States, the inverse is true. We spend, for every dollar we spend on healthcare, we only spend about 55 cents on social services. So we literally have the accent on the wrong syllable. And it has a consequence. The countries that spend roughly that ratio of 2 to 1 social services to healthcare have better health. Next slide. If you can advance it once and twice. Okay, so this is a study by Rand who replicated what those two women did and showed the very same outcomes. In fact, confirmed everything that they had shown. I'm going to skip through this fairly quickly, but it basically shows that if you look at the dark orange line and the dark blue line, that's a comparison of the European Union social spending versus the US social spending from 1980 to 2010. So 30 years of social spending And you see the gap with the US being much less than the European Union during that 30-year period. Now look at the light orange line and the light blue line. Those are respectively the EU's life expectancy at birth from 1980 to 2010, and the US life expectancy at birth from 1980 to 2010. You see in 1980, those two life expectancies are the same. And then over that 30-year period, this gap emerges with the US life expectancy growing, but growing at a much slower rate than the EU life expectancy. And then those bottom lines are US health spending, which you see is growing much faster than European Union health spending. So it's that spending outside of the healthcare system that actually produces, or at least is strongly correlated with better health. Next slide. And so these are Rand's conclusions. If you can just hit it one time, please. They note that higher levels of social spending are strongly associated with better health. So I just want to repeat that, because if you take one message from this talk, make it this one. Higher levels of social spending, non-medical spending, are associated with better health. Hit it one more time, please. The association is particularly strong for public, which means government spending, as opposed to private social spending. And one more time. And the association between social spending and health outcomes is strongest where income inequality is the greatest. In other words, in countries like the United States, it matters even more to invest in social spending if you want to improve health outcomes. Next slide, please. Just hit it twice. I'm going to skip the last one. Next slide. Okay, so I also want to talk about white health. U.S. white life expectancy is about 79 years, which is about the same as Costa Rica. Next slide. But U.S. whites are living shorter lives than, hit it one time, please, than Belgium, Chile, Denmark, Lebanon, Slovenia. One more again. Austria, Finland, Germany, Greece, Ireland, Malta, Netherlands, Portugal, UK again. Canada, of course, Cyprus, France, Iceland, Israel, South Korea, Luxembourg, Monaco, New Zealand, Norway, Sweden again. Andorra, Australia, Italy, San Marino, Singapore, Spain, Switzerland, and again. And Japan. There are 33 countries in the world with longer life expectancy than U.S. whites. Hit it one time again. In 1990, there were only 17 countries that had longer life expectancy than U.S. whites. U.S. white life expectancy is actually, it's falling off the charts. I mean, it's so bad that health disparities researchers no longer use whites as a benchmark. We're much better off using immigrant Latinos or immigrant Asians or, quite frankly, immigrant anybody. Immigrants have much better health than their American-born counterparts, but as they acculturate and become more American, their health actually gets worse. Next slide. We can learn a lot by studying immigrant health to improve American health. I often say, don't believe me, believe the National Academy of Sciences. This is a report that was done in 2013 by the Institute of Medicine. Next slide. And these were their conclusions. Next slide. The panel was struck by the gravity of its findings. For many years, Americans have been dying at younger ages than people in almost all other high-income countries. This disadvantage has been getting worse for 3 decades, especially among women. Next slide. The U.S. health disadvantage cannot be fully explained by health disparities that exist among people who are uninsured or poor. These are real issues, health disparities, but they don't explain by themselves why our overall American health is so bad. Several studies are now suggesting that even advantaged Americans, those who are white, insured, college-educated, or upper income, are in worse health than similar individuals in other countries. Next slide. I'm going to guess that most of you don't know that, but you could surprise me. This is the PBS NewsHour asking about white health. Why are so many white Americans dying young? Next slide. And this is the Wall Street Journal asking a similar question, looking at life expectancy declining for white women in the United States. Next slide. And this is a figure called Deaths of Despair. Next slide. Which was popularized by these 2 economists at Princeton, one by the name of Angus Deaton, who won the Nobel Prize in 2015, and his wife, and Case. Next slide. And they produced a study which showed this very dramatic graphic. And this graphic shows, now you're looking at mortality rates. These are death rates from 1990 to 2010. Mortality rates you generally want to see going down. And that's what you see on this slide for many different major population groups. That bright blue line in the middle is US Latinos. So you see this steady decline from 1990 to 2010 in mortality rates. That's a good sign. That heavy red line up at the top is US white, which is a shocking change in the mortality rates of US whites. There has been an epidemic of death in US whites in the United States. And so we decided to explore this question. Next slide. It's featured in this book by Angus Eaton and Ann Case called Deaths of Despair. Next slide. And we decided to look across California to see where we were finding these kinds of death rates amongst white people. And when we did this, we find these patterns particularly up in the northern part of the state, where you see shocking rates of premature death of relatively young people, driven primarily by alcohol use, suicide, and drug overdoses, disproportionately opiates. Next slide. You can see Kern County down there too. I'm going to show you something in a minute. These are the counties that voted for the current president, and 25 of the 28 counties with high white mortality rates voted for the current president. So we think that this may be an epidemiologic phenomenon that's driving a political phenomenon. Next slide. Now we decided we wanted to actually burrow down. Oh, no, these slides are not here. We actually did an analysis. Now this is a different slide set than the one I was actually going to show you, but we did an analysis that looked at South Kern County and looked at the rates of suicide, alcohol-related mortality, and opiate use, and we found rates that were between 1.5 and 3 times greater than the rest of the state. This phenomenon is happening in Bakersfield. It's happening in southern Kern County. It's happening throughout the Central Valley. So part of this work is about telling the truth about what actually causes poor health. So these are real zip codes and real life expectancies. Next slide. And these are real zip codes and real high school graduation rates, which correlate in a stunningly painful way to life expectancy. Next slide. This is the New Sacramento Airport Terminal, where we decided we'd have a conversation with the legislature on the walls of that terminal, and they started calling us, asking us why we were decreasing property values in their districts. Next slide. And we decided we would actually literally decorate the walls and the downtown San Francisco during the American Public Health Association meeting a few years ago with this message. Next slide. We did something similar in San Diego at the American Public Health Association meeting last year, or I guess it's the year before last. Next slide. And there are just several of these images that will come up. There's another one. Next slide. And another one. And next slide, please. Okay, so what we know is that 80% of what shapes your health happens outside the healthcare system. And next slide. And how does that happen? Let me give you the second most important message of this presentation. It's this concept of chronic stress. We all have stress in our lives. The only question is, how many resources do we have to essentially manage that stress? Life is a balance between stressors and resources. And the more stress you have, the more resources you need. The less stress you have, the less resources that you need. And this concept of allostatic load is basically the balance between stressors and resources. Next slide. And this explains how the outside environment gets under the skin and changes physiology. If you advance it once, please. We interpret the stressor through our brains, through the hypothalamus. Advance it again, please. The hypothalamus sends a message to the pituitary gland, which is a hormone. The pituitary gland, advance it again, sends a message to the adrenal glands, which sit adjacent to the kidneys. Please advance it one more time. And then finally advance it again. The adrenal glands release a hormone called cortisol, amongst other hormones, including adrenaline and a variety of different other hormones. Next slide. And next slide again. Okay, so when you're stressed out, like I was when this technology was not working, cortisol causes increased cardiac output. It rallies glucose for your muscles to be able to
yeah, because they took 30 minutes to just.
Hello, I'm getting somebody on the line here.
No worries, I muted.
It enhances your immune functions and it stimulates the growth of neurons in your hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, which all you need to know about that is that those are critical parts of your brain for what's called executive function. Executive function is essentially rapid fire decision making. So when you're acutely stressed, when you're walking across the street and you see a truck heading towards you, you're in the blue. But if you're living in a low-income community and constantly looking for resources, in other words, you can't find healthy food, you can't find good schools for your children, you're experiencing crime and racism, there's no places to exercise, the parks are not in good states of repair, you can't find clean drinking water because you've got contaminants of nitrates and arsenic in your well water. You're constantly stressed out. Now you're in the red, and cortisol is circulating through your body 24/7. And when that's happening, cortisol causes almost the exact opposite of what it does in the blue. It causes high blood pressure and heart disease independent of your diet and your behaviors. It also has the double whammy of it makes you crave high fat, high salt, high sugar foods. So not only is your body changing as a result of that chronic cortisol, it's also changing your behaviors and making you crave foods that are not good for you. It stimulates glucose intolerance and insulin resistance, which puts you at risk for type 2 diabetes. It turns down your immune system, so you're now more prone to infections. It turns up your inflammatory system, which makes your body more prone to wear and tear of inflammation. And it causes atrophy and cell death in that same part of the brain that I told you was responsible for rapid fire decision making, the kind of decision making you need to make every day when you're searching for resources. Next slide. It also impacts your memory and a variety of different things. So let me offer you a framework to think about this that has been helpful to many of us who practice this on a daily basis. Next slide. The framework starts downstream. You read this sort of from right to left. It starts with the medical model. And the medical model says that if you see high rates of premature death, like I showed you on those maps, you have to think that that's correlated with high rates of disease and injury. And if you see high rates of disease and injury, that's correlated with high levels of risk. And risk can take two forms. It can take the form of risk factors, like having genetic predispositions to disease, and so-called risk behaviors, the things we do to ourselves, the drinking, the smoking, the driving without a seatbelt. And the medical model basically says that this is all we need to concern ourselves about, the risk factors and behaviors that produce disease that cause premature mortality. And the drivers in the medical model are genetics, which actually is very expensive to change and generally doesn't work. Access to healthcare, which typically occurs in 15-minute interventions in a cubicle, and individual health knowledge. So this is the brochures, the pamphlets that tell you not to smoke, not to drink, to drive with your seatbelt, et cetera, et cetera. All of that is necessary. It's just insufficient to address the problems that we're seeing that are operating at the societal level. Next slide. So what many of us have argued is that, while that is true downstream, and it's a $3.7 trillion enterprise to try to fix people downstream as individuals in the healthcare system, that there's a whole set of upstream opportunities that we routinely ignore. And again, reading this from the right to the left, we look at social inequities in places like Arvin in South Kern, or even parts of Bakersfield, parts of Oakland, parts of LA, Baltimore that I showed you, South Indiana. Those are manifestations of social inequity. Those are physical neighborhood manifestations of people being systematically deprived of health protective resources. And again, I'm talking about things like parks and decent schools and grocery stores and sidewalks and drinkable water. And as you move upstream, you start to notice that there are policies that steer resources to some communities and steer resources, the same resources, away from other communities. We work in the Eastern Coachella Valley, where you see Palm Springs and Coachella and the Eastern Valley are in the same county. Palm Springs has got green golf courses. The Eastern Coachella Valley has dusty streets and wells that are contaminated with arsenic. Those are policies. That doesn't have to exist. That's not natural. Those are choices that we have made politically about who deserves resources and who doesn't. And at the end of the day, when you try to understand why these policies were created, you go back to what I showed you with Abraham Lincoln, which is a narrative of exclusion, a narrative that says some people matter, the people in Palm Springs, and some people do not, the people in the Eastern Coachella Valley. So there's no sidewalks in the Eastern Coachella Valley for the most part. There are huge, beautiful, well-maintained sidewalks in Palm Springs, as well as the golf courses, as well as the McMansions and the resources and all that sort of thing. So asking ourselves, well, why is that the case? You're forced to sort of acknowledge this framework that at the end of the day, a narrative of exclusion drives those decisions. Next slide. So when you look at health disparities, they're manifesting themselves primarily downstream. Next slide. When you look at health inequities, you see that those are forged upstream. Upstream health inequities create downstream health disparities. Next slide. You can just take the word health out and talk about inequities producing disparities, or next slide, you can talk about conditions creating consequences. And that's the way I like to think about it. We spend a lot of time and money in those slides I showed you. The reason that the US is so out of sync with the rest of the world is that we spend most of our money managing downstream consequences. And we spend very little of our money upstream trying to invest in the right healthy conditions for communities to be able to meaningfully participate and choose healthy options that are available to the rest of us. Next slide. And next slide again. Hit it again, and again, and again. And so the consequences we see downstream are not just in the health system. You see them in the education system with school absence, truancy leading to grade failure, leading to dropout. Next slide. What we're arguing is that we should spend less time just focused downstream. Not that downstream isn't important. We have to treat things that are happening downstream because there's real suffering downstream, but we can't just treat downstream. We have to look upstream as well and think about where we can intervene. Next slide. We know that we can intervene in places, in communities, and that's part of what we've been doing with the California Endowment in the 14 places across California, including in South Kern, to organize people and to build power. Next slide. Because we want to change the policies that create the conditions in South Kern, and we recognize that those policies aren't just created in South Kern, they're created regionally, and they're created at the state, and they're created federally. So we want people to operate at all of those levels. Next slide. And at the end of the day, we recognize that if you want to change policy, you have to change the narrative. And so we're investing very much in organizations like South Kern Soul, other newspapers, in social media, in huge campaigns to change the narrative, the way we think about the people of South Kern, so that we can change the policies that can change the conditions. Next slide. At the heart of this is power. And so a lot of the work that we do in South Kern is about building power, social, political, and economic power, and a critical mass of people in South Kern so that they can participate in political decision-making that shapes their lives. And also that they can change the narrative about who is South Kern and who deserves to be heard and who deserves to speak for that community. Next slide. And hit it again, please. Okay, so if you want to save costs, you look downstream. Next slide. If you want to actually create health, you invest upstream. Next slide. The name of this game is actually bringing some of the resources downstream, which are expenditures, into the investments upstream that prevent the downstream consequences. And that is essentially what a social contract is. It's in that green space where we invest in social policies and social benefits to try to reduce the burden on the downstream healthcare system. That's what other developed countries do well. That's what the United States does very poorly. I'm going to stop there to save us some time because that's the basic message. And hopefully we'll have, at least a little bit of time for some questions.
Thank you, Dr. Iton. So I have gathered a few questions that people have sent to me via the private chat. If you have additional questions, please send it to me via the chat box and I will add it to our list. So first is from a student named Michael. He says, healthcare person is high here in the States, but is it because it is a lot cheaper than other countries? And if you can elaborate a little more.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the first part of the question. His healthcare is what?
Healthcare per person is higher in the United States. Is it because it's cheaper, a lot cheaper in other countries?
Well, yes, that's part of it. I mean, it's substantially cheaper. Health insurance in most other countries, because they have, for the most part, single-payer health plans, and single payers take out a lot of the administrative costs that are associated with elevating the cost of healthcare. In this country, we have all of this paperwork, all of these middle men and women, and of course we have profit in the healthcare system. So the system is designed to actually enrich people who make medical equipment, sell pharmaceuticals, own health insurance companies. In other countries, there isn't a profit motive in healthcare. And when you take profit out of the equation, and then you streamline a lot of the administration as these single payer programs do. By single payer, it means that there's just one insurance company, and it's generally either government owned and run, or it's government managed and regulated, so that everybody has access to the same level of benefits. And some of them are funded by taxes, others are funded by taxes and co-payments. And so for the most part, it's more efficient and cheaper. And you don't have the profit, at least you don't have nearly as great a profit motive as you do in the United States, where literally all of the major and most profitable industries in the world in the United States. So you've got the pharmaceutical industry, you've got the health insurance industry, you've got the medical device manufacturing industry and all the technology associated with that. They are all some of the most profitable organizations in the world, and they're all essentially feeding at the trough of the American healthcare system.
Thank you. Next is from Kim. If white individuals in general are traditionally more economically disadvantaged and have better access to healthcare than people of color, then what role does American diet play?
Yeah, I'm not sure I heard the first part of the question, but the American diet is terrible. I mean, there's no two or three ways about it. We have very high levels of obesity. We have very high levels of diabetes. We have, even amongst people who are not overweight, we have metabolic syndrome in many of those people, so that they're essentially at risk of diabetes-like consequences. And that leads to heart disease and strokes and a whole host of cardiovascular illnesses, and in fact cancer as well. So the American diet is not good. In fact, it's terrible, and we've exported it to different parts of the world. It doesn't fully explain the differences we see in health outcomes, but it does contribute. And part of it is that we don't regulate marketing of unhealthy food to children, and so we allow soda companies and cereal companies and a wide variety of different profit-making industrial concerns to market their products directly to children. And very few other developed countries allow that to happen. So in essence, because we make our children essentially addicted to sugar at very young ages, we promote this obesogenic environment.
Thank you. This one is from Aaron. How does sunlight correlate with death rates? Northern California has a much higher death rate, but it's also has more consistent cloud coverage.
I got to say, I don't know anything about that. I will tell you that, you know, some of the longest living countries in the world, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, you know, they have very cold and dark climates. They don't spend a lot of time in the sun, yet they live very long and they're healthy. I don't think, I'm not aware of any link to sunlight and life expectancy. I am very aware of how societies are organized in terms of having strong or weak social contracts that correlates very well with life expectancy. So I don't have an answer to that question.
No worries, thank you. Next question is from Marabella. What can the public do to change the political narrative of exclusion to one of the inclusion?
Yeah, I think that you know, if we weren't rushing through this, I would spend a little more time on this. But this is, I think, one of the unique things that's happened in California. If you take the undocumented population, for instance, and you look at what we've done policy-wise in California for undocumented, our undocumented brothers and sisters, you know, we have undocumented young people up to the age of 18 that are included under full-scope California Medi-Cal. And we just expanded that to undocumented Californians up until the age of 26. We're now moving to include folks over the age of 65 who are undocumented under health insurance, and the goal is to cover the entire undocumented population. We have driver's licenses for undocumented folks. We have in-state tuition and scholarships available to undocumented folks. They can take the California bar and become lawyers and practice. They can take the medical boards, become doctors and practice. That's not true in many other states. In California, we treat our undocumented brothers and sisters like brothers and sisters. That's part of a narrative. That's not an accident. That's hard work of people who have created essentially an inclusive narrative in California to include all of us. And there have been very focused campaigns to essentially improve how Californians perceived undocumented and other immigrants. So it's not just an accident of fate. In 1994, we had Prop 187 in California, which tried to ban undocumented people from schools and from any social services. And it passed. It passed by 55%. That was not that long ago. And since that time, people have been doing a hard work to change the narrative around undocumented Californians, and it's paying off in terms of policy. So California has numerous examples of how you can change the narrative, which ultimately change policy, which changes conditions. And we're actually trying to show the rest of the country, you know, how you develop an inclusive narrative.
Great, thank you. Next one is from a student, Oscar. What specific challenges does the Central Valley in California face when it comes to health care disparities?
Yeah, thank you for that question. There are a lot of disparities being faced by folks in the Central Valley. I mean, the Central Valley is a place with a lot of low-income people and a handful of very wealthy people. And there isn't a very diverse economy. It's primarily agricultural and some of the extractive industries like oil and, you know, some other industries that just basically are just pulling wealth out of the ground. Those kinds of industries tend not to share the wealth very well. So you have, not only do you have a lot of low-income people and then a very small number of very wealthy people, but that small amount of wealthy people control the economy there. And when you control the economy, you have a lot of political influence. So part of the challenge in the Central Valley is to essentially create a different power dynamic, to organize people so that they can have more influence over policy happening locally and regionally, and to shape agriculture in a way that is a little bit more egalitarian. There are some very good agricultural companies out in the Central Valley who are doing very good things for everybody. So I don't want to give the impression that that they're all just taking profits and leaving people to suffer. There are some very good ones, but for the most part, the Central Valley struggles health care-wise because of a lack of investment in low-income people, undocumented people, farm workers, and others who don't have a lot of political power. So for us, the equation is how do you build more political power and more political representation to shift the investments to allocate more to the needs of low-income people in the Central Valley. I will say this as well, though, that we can learn a lot from the health of immigrants. And immigrants tend to be healthier than Americans in general. And over time, as they become more American, their health actually gets worse. So immigrants teach us a lot because they tend to form very tight social networks and they support each other. And when you feel supported and included in a community, it's good for your health. So we study immigrants so that we can actually translate a lot of the immigrant natural behaviors into larger behaviors for all of us in California.
Just a couple more questions I have in line. This is from Cindy. Does the quality of health care change with someone that is on Medi-Cal versus someone who has work or private health insurance?
Yeah, the simple answer is yes. So while Medi-Cal is better than not having insurance, Medi-Cal still is a second-class health insurance system. There's no question about it. I, as a practicing doctor, I don't do this consciously, but if I have two patients with the same disease, the same scenario, one with Medi-Cal and one with private insurance, there are just things I can get for the privately insured patients that I can't get for the Medi-Cal patients. Things like physical therapy, things like, nutrition counseling, even things like mammograms, I can get faster for the privately insured patient than I can for the Medi-Cal insured patients. And that's outrageous, but that's how the system is structured. And again, most other developed countries have a universal system, so everybody's treated the same. In this country, we have Medi-Cal, we have Medicare, we have the VA, we have private insurance with different levels of coverage. We stratify everything. We make it much more complex and much more expensive. And we do it because we devalue certain people. So the goal is to, as some of the national politicians are talking about, a system that actually includes everybody, like a Medicare for all system, or some kind of system where we're all treated, according to our needs, not according to our wallet.
Okay, I'm going to merge two questions, one from Edith and Oscar. They're asking, what career advice would you give a college student who's interested in advancing health equality? And as individuals, what can we do to improve our communities and our own life expectancies?
Yeah, great question. And I advise students all the time, so I answer this question a lot. I think that if you're interested in improving the health of your community, public health is the best career choice for you. It's diverse. It allows you to do a lot of things. You can do data, you can do analysis, you can do policy, you can do direct services, you can do communications. So I would encourage you to look at a public health career. You can do it without getting a master's of public health, but that's not a bad way to do it. A number of undergraduate institutions now offer an undergraduate degree in public health. So I would encourage you to look at public health. Other related career choices in that space are obviously nursing is a strong career choice. It focuses a little bit more on clinical, although there are opportunities in nursing to do much more public health related work. And then looking at public policy degrees as well. because we need to change and build a social contract in California to invest in people in a more equitable way. And to do that, we need to change policies. We need universal health care. We need universal child care. We need paid sick leave. We need protections for workers, who are on the front lines, for farm workers, for people that are working in dangerous industries. We need people to, if they have a history of incarceration, we need to be able to allow them to rehabilitate themselves quickly and get back into society and get jobs. And of course, we have a whole host of housing challenges that we have to address. So public policy, public health, nursing, those are degrees that I would encourage you to take a look at.
All right. Do you have time for a couple more, or are we out of time?
No, I'm good. I can keep going.
All right. So the next question is from Terry. How do we change the narrative with the big business?
Well, I think one of the benefits, and there are very few, but one of the benefits of COVID-19 is a big lesson to business about, how fragile our social structure is and how quickly our entire economy can be brought to its knees with a pandemic. And so, business is now thinking about, well, how do we prevent this? Well, the ways to prevent this are universal health insurance, paid sick leave, investing in local public health so it can actually fortify its capacity and detect and contain infectious disease outbreaks. COVID-19 is the first of what will inevitably be a series of global pandemics driven by zoonotic diseases, diseases that come from animals and make the leap into humans. This is not the last. We're going to see a series of them. And so if we think we can just try to squeak our way through this and go back to the status quo, we're sorely mistaken. Most business leaders understand that. So I believe, and you've seen already some business leaders calling for universal health care, calling for greater investments in childcare when schools are closed and families can't work because they have to take care of their children now at home. They're recognizing the need to invest in these supports for families if they want their businesses to keep running.
Great. Next question is from Professor Dharamala. He saw a documentary that talked about poverty and healthcare. Could being poor, Black, or Latino be considered as a pre-existing condition?
Well, I think it depends on how you want to think about it. I mean, I think of social vulnerability, people who are made vulnerable by virtue, in most instances in this country, of their race, about things over which they have no control, nor would they want to have any control. So we have a legacy of racism in this country, which has structured our institutions and created a lack of solidarity across groups, across races. So we view, instead of an us paradigm, we view a kind of a tribal paradigm where, certain groups compete with other groups for resources. So I think that the question is, why do we have this social vulnerability? And I would argue that, while it's driven by racism, there's collateral damage. There is and I showed you some of the data, but there is a white rural epidemic in premature death that's larger than the entire U.S. HIV/AIDS epidemic. More than 500,000 people have died prematurely as a result of that epidemic. That epidemic is disproportionately in white people. And I would argue that they are collateral damage of racist policies. So to the extent that there is a pre-existing illness, that pre-existing illness is really about social vulnerability, of which race is a huge part because of the legacy of racism, but it's not exclusively race. You certainly see it also with people who have mental illness, or people who are disabled, or people who are LGBTQ, or people who are formerly incarcerated. So there's stigma across the board for different populations that impacts their ability to pursue a healthy life.
Great. So I'm going to merge two questions together from Cindy and Eddie now that says, what can one individual do at an individual level to empower ourselves and our community for health equality? And how do we engage people into taking control of their health by getting regular checkups?
Yeah, I'm going to actually kind of push back on that question a little bit because I think we ask ourselves this question about what can an individual do too often. And I'm going to argue that doing this as an individual is insufficient. You have to organize people. You have to do this together. You have to bring people together who are similarly situated, and you have to build power. And power is about relationships. Power is about us. It's not about me. So I think the premise of it's not a premise, but I think that the question should be essentially restructured to think about what can you do with your community, what can you do with people who are similarly situated, and try to think less about just I and more about we. You know, but if you forced me, I would tell you that the things that you can do is you can actually advocate. You can write op-eds in your local newspaper about the fact that folks in your community lack health insurance or lack paid sick leave or lack dental care. You can make arguments for why policy is insufficient, you know, when it comes to the needs of these people. You can talk to your representatives and hold them accountable for making policy that's more equitable. But I would argue that, you know, individual action, while beneficial, can be magnified multiple-fold if you organize people and work together.
Great. What can be done to continuing education available to everyone, giving a better chance at success?
Well, you know, it's interesting. California actually has a fairly good and robust community college system, which facilitates continuing education for folks at a relatively low cost. I mean, the challenge for people to engage in that is that they generally have to work and live while they go to college, and it's the housing costs and the sort of the inadequate wages that people get at jobs that make it difficult for people to participate in community college. But if you compare our community college fees to those in other states, California is very accessible. So I do think that you know, the challenge is really how do we get employers to facilitate people actually getting continuing education so that they can develop and work their way up a career ladder that has meaningful opportunities within the same institution. And we've done some of that work in healthcare to try to take the frontline staff and create meaningful career ladders for them into nursing or into technology careers or into administrative careers. And employers like that because they like the idea of having long-term employees who know the business well. So I do think California has some advantages when it comes to continuing education. The challenge that we see most often is housing costs and inadequate wage to allow people to essentially work part-time and go to school and get you know, more credentials. Also, the community college system tends to be disarticulated, not attached, not coordinated with the employer and industrial base. So oftentimes the skills that you get in some of these programs are not the skills that employers are looking for.
We got another question from community member Reina. We have a culture of investing in our incarcerating poor, Black, brown, and undocumented people rather than investing in preventive programs. What message would you give to local leaders regarding and how it impacts the health of our community?
Yeah, great question. And many of your colleagues in South Kern and elsewhere across the state have been working on this issue in Bakersfield and with the Kern County school system. trying to break the school to prison pipeline, advancing the Schools Not Prisons campaign statewide. There's been an enormous number of wins, Prop 47, Prop 57, and a host of other changes to state policy, including the elimination of willful defiance in certain cases as a grounds for suspending or expelling students. Kern County School District actually was sued successfully by Dolores Huerta and others on these basic grounds. So there's been enormous progress that's happened across California and in places like Bakersfield and Kern County on this issue. More progress needs to be made, there's no question about it. But again, it goes back to organizing, having a good strategy, changing the narrative, and holding accountable those institutions like the county school board and local school boards, the sheriff, the police department, and the board of supervisors to essentially develop policies that are not overly punitive and to allow the creation of meaningful opportunities for people, either once they get caught up in the criminal justice system or that prevent them, divert them from the criminal justice system in the first place, because we know that once you're kind of tarred with that system, it's hard because of stigma to essentially reintegrate into society in a meaningful way.
Great. And I'll probably just conclude on this last question as we're approaching 1 o'clock. And this is from Shelley. How successful do you feel we have been as a state in serving the mentally ill within the rural and minority populations?
Shelley, not successful at all. And I think that there are a couple of problems in the way that we organize our community mental health services. You know, we closed many decades ago. We closed many of the congregate facilities, essentially the mental health hospitals, and we released people, and we promised we would invest in community mental health. You know, we passed statewide propositions, you know, to the millionaires tax, Prop 63, to try to get at deeper investment in community mental health services. We just have not lived up to our commitment to invest in community mental health services at all, and it's an absolute scandal, and we need to do much better. I will say this though, that there's some fairly good science that shows that trauma, adverse childhood experiences, and continued trauma early in life predisposes people to emotional and physical health, you know, adversity as adults. And there's prevention that we need to do at the community level. In addition to treating people with mental illness, we need to prevent the trauma that young people are experiencing in their homes, in those communities. Poverty is probably the single biggest contributor to adversity in childhood. And yet we let millions of children in California, we have the highest poverty rate in the United States. We let millions of children in poverty languish without the resources that they need. That's a trauma. That trauma changes you physiologically. I showed you some of the stressors. Stressors and traumas are similar. It changes your physiology. It changes how your hypothalamic pituitary axis, that sort of physiology that I showed you, reacts to stress as an adult, and it actually predisposes you to emotional, you know, illness. So while we do have to treat and radically enhance our community mental health capacity, we also have to take prevention as seriously as we do treatment. If you're talking, Nikki, I can't hear you.
Oh, sorry. Thank you very much for your time and patience, especially as we were going through the technical difficulties. And thank you to our audience. As going back in our feeds in the back, it looks like our first Zoom, we had over 350 people trying to log in at one time, which clogged up the system is what I'm getting feedback from Zoom. So that's a first for us, so we really appreciate that. And everyone who joined in to us today, thank you so much for participating in today's distinguished speaker. Professor Dharamala, thank you very much for joining us as well. This concludes our speaker series for this year, and please help in getting new speakers for next year by presenting them to this Office of Student Life and your student government association. If at any time you have any other questions, please feel free to email us at studentlife@bakersfieldcollege.edu. That again is studentlife@bakersfieldcollege.edu, and we will try to respond back in a timely manner. People have been asking if the recordings will be available. It shall be available via Facebook and YouTube as soon as we can get the transcription process through. If you have any other things, thank you very much. If not, it's been a pleasure. Keep safe, stay at home, and enjoy your time. Thank you so much, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Iton. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you, Nikki.
Thank you, Charles. Have a good one.
Thank you, you too. Thanks for the patience, the perseverance. Well done, well done.
Yes.
Okay.
And
Right.
for our students who are,
Ellie, you sent a message regarding the recording. We will have the recording on Facebook and YouTube. So keep a lookout for the Bakersfield College Student Government Association Facebook page, and it'll be available there.
yeah, and for our students who are still on, please vote for BCSGA elections. Just go to Inside BC and click to vote.
Yes, indeed. Please eat your fruits and vegetables.
Okay.
All right. This meeting will be closing in 5 seconds.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.